I really love Star Trek. I think we're in a safe space here where we can admit that Star Trek is awesome. It's one of the first things that I ever got into as a fandom. I think maybe Star Wars beats it just about because I got the X-Wing and TIE Fighter video games, but like actual media that I watched on TV, Star Trek has to be my first love. And I also love the Federation, and I love the way that it's communicated to us, and I love the way that people misunderstand it as well. People get this idea that it's this automated luxury space communism, and it's super not. It's totally not, in fact. But the Federation itself does sort of claim that it is, and that makes it weird and interesting for all kinds of reasons. It's great. It's this theoretically super liberal future state that sticks its fingers in its ears whenever anyone brings up all of the really shady stuff that it gets up to. In a sense, the Federation's almost boring because it's a very Western-style federal nation, and it's super familiar to everyone. It's also got a lot of the same problems that modern nations have, and that makes it feel very current, even kind of 50 years after it was being dreamt up. It feels very prescient, feels very relevant, and the issues that it plays with over time are ones that are perennial if you're in a Western democracy. And, being a Western-style democracy also means that it's a shadier institution than we like to think. Because when we say, Western-style nation, you initially think, oh, that must be a great thing. And then you stop and remember that there is some non-zero chance that way out in Pakistan, some CIA officer may well be waterboarding someone for the good of their nation right now. And yeah, that's what the Federation is. Don't make a mistake about it. They don't like to talk about it, but that is who they are. They are just like us in lots of regards, and that's one of them. Just like us, they've found out that you can't be naive when you're dealing with implacable space foes. You kind of do have to get your hands dirty, and that's fine. I don't mean that to talk down the Federation at all. To me, it actually makes the Federation more likable and more realistic, because they're this really flawed entity and that has really good intentions. And so that's something that I think that most of us, at least most of us in the West, can see ourselves in. It's great. And this is the stuff that you want to see from a futurized government, right? It's interesting to write in, it's got contradictions, it's got good ideas that you can fight for. It's great. And because it's familiar to us, the audience as well, it gives writers a lot of scope to not explain things and just assume that we're all coming along and we'll throw whatever aliens and weird stuff at what are very modern and familiar institutions, and see how the things that we claim to hold dear today hold up under those kind of pressures. So yeah, it's a great institution. It's well constructed for fiction. I like it. So what is the UFP, the United Federation of Planets? Well, as the name implies, it is a federation, a federal form of government, which has a couple of 100 member worlds, planets, which is implied by the name, but the planets is important, as we will get to. It's a 100% democratic institution, but it runs kind of on the same lines as the US. We don't know exactly, it's not well gone into, but this is definitely not a confederal system, it's not a Swiss system, this is pure federalism. There's a president, there's a legislature, there's courts, and a constitution, the things that you would expect to see from a modern state. And that's kind of why I say it's boring. It probably didn't seem quite so boring back in the 70s, and this model seemed to be a bit more utopian, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But today it's a bit of a shrug as far as political systems go, nothing exciting. So much so that I don't really want to talk about that part of it all that much. It's democratic, it's accountable, it's as good as what we have today, for better or worse. It's just sort of assumed that this is what a good future government would look like, and that's fine. I don't want to challenge that too much. I'll leave that to Robert Heinlein. This is also presumably why almost nothing of the Star Trek canon looks at the government at all. It's just sort of there, and the focus is very much on the military, Starfleet, or it's on kind of the fringes. It's out on the edges where the rule of the Federation starts to break down. Not because, the president is a terrible person abusing his executive power or anything, just because it's a long way away and it's removed and there's, borders and jurisdictional conflicts and stuff like that. That's much more where the action of Star Trek is to be found. So the first really interesting thing about the Federation is membership of the Federation. Because unlike the US, which was not entirely, but broadly made up of states founded by existing US citizens, not entirely, but broadly, the UFP only takes pre-existing, fully sovereign states or planets in this context. You can't join as half a world. You have to join as a whole world under one planetary government. You don't have to be 100% united as such, but there does have to be a planetary government that the UFP sees as legitimately representing the whole planet. Things like the UN would not count, not even close. The sovereign entity needs to be the whole world. I think this is a weird choice, and it's sort of philosophically weird as well, because planets are really huge, and while within the scope of Star Trek we mostly only see little snippets of planets, we know already that planets are like billions of people spread across huge land masses, and they obviously have a lot of different opinions, a lot of different needs and drives, even just within one world. Star Trek, gets criticised a bit as having this trope of, a planet of hats, a planet of people who are kind of all the same. They all share the same beliefs and values and whatnot. And I think that that's true of the Federation as well. It just sort of assumes that everyone on each member state planet is on the same page or close enough. I think that's really optimistic of the Federation to think that that's true. Within the canon, we mostly see that it is true, so I suppose it's a bit of a moot issue, but it's interesting to me, and it does create some slightly odd corner cases which aren't particularly explored. But man, we got to ask questions about what happens if half your world wants to join the UFP, and they're not allowed to. It's the whole planet or nothing. But that also means that they now have to conquer the other half of the planet and or compromise the others into agreeing with it. That does not seem like a great policy. That seems like it's bound to cause problems. There's also questions that are much more relevant in space than on Earth, about things like colonies and things like moons, about who owns them and how they're represented. Like, why can't the moon split off and be its own separate UFP member if they think that that's best for them? That's not handled at all, which is a pity, because I think that's a really interesting thing to look at. Is also getting a bit closer to home, perhaps less foreseeable when Star Trek was being written, but seeing half a world saying, well, we don't want to leave the UFP, but we don't want to be represented by this other half of the world's government, a sort of Catalonian Scottish exit from a whole world body, and the UFP sort of doesn't recognise that that's a thing that can happen, and that's kind of that's a bit of a failing in this conception of government. I mean, yes, I know that they're a united federation of planets, but planets are big places, and I think that there should be a little bit more interest paid to whatever it might be, West Venus and East Venus or something. And a particular part of that is that should a planet or half a planet or whatever want to split, technically that will pull the whole planet out of the UFP. They can't stay members of the Federation if they no longer represent the whole of their world. Again, that seems like it's primed to create conflicts, especially since the Federation is so powerful and so scientifically advanced. The issue of which government gets recognized and which government is seen as the member or speaking for the whole planet is super important. The Federation probably doesn't put up with a lot of internal, proper civil wars, but if you're the government that's recognized by the Federation and you can call in external humanitarian support, doctors, food, stuff, then that gives you a huge amount of power and influence over how your people are going to see you, compared to what would be perceived as the rebels, who do not have access to any of that and may not even have really technology at all. That is important. I think that when this was being dreamt up, it was trying to be simple enough that we could conceptually understand it without falling into a lot of the problems that bodies like the UN have in handling kind of conflict with member states. Technically the UFP is somewhere between being a nation and a supranation, and it was just, it was broadly written and left as it is, and I think that that's fine. But I would like to see this stuff more looked at, because someone somewhere, when they were writing a constitution, said, well, if East Venus wants to leave, they get to go screw themselves. That was a deliberate choice, not explored, which is a pity. On top of that, when you're trying to join the UFP, you have to buy into its founding values, and not just in the sense of you promise that you will do in future. They really come and check. They want to make sure that everything that the UFP stands for, you are already doing. And to a certain degree, the sort of democratic governance and rule of law and peaceful cooperation is good, but achieving those can obviously be quite difficult. And yet the Federation says, well, to some degree we will help, but not that much. You've got to figure it out for yourself. If you want to get into our, I won't say utopia, but if you want to get into our super cool space club, then figure it out. We are not the ones who are going to fix this for you. And in that sense, you could say that the Federation is actually a bit right-wing. Far from being space socialism, they make you prove that you want it, and you kind of have to elevate yourself. The Federation is not in the business of elevating you, and is not also in the business of bending its own rules to give people membership. I think that's important, and it's one reason why the Federation continues to kind of survive, honestly, because they do have this sense that being a member is meaningful and worthwhile, and something that's worth working for as a whole society. And that kind of brings us on to the Federation approach to economics. And like any good space empire, it doesn't really have an approach to economics. At least it doesn't stipulate an economic system. Much is made of the fact that humans in Star Trek don't use money or cash, but that's actually a personal choice. Within the core worlds of the Federation, humans basically don't, and they can do this. We only live to better ourselves and the rest of humanity stuff, but plenty of humans live out there with currency of varying sorts, and there's a Federation currency as well, and so it's you get to choose. And that's cool. I think that's what a federal system should be doing. Each world already had an economy when it joined, and it's not joining just for the economic perks. And so, just leaving it up to them and saying, yeah, crack on, we'll help you with your trade and we'll help you with some building of whatever you want to build, but how you pay for that is up to you. That's quite a robustly liberal approach to things. That again, if you want your world to be fully automated luxury space communism, then, well, you make it happen. And the Federation respects your choice not to use currency, but when you're not on a Federation core world, well, you better have some credits and some latinum and some stuff to trade, because other people are not going to respect that, and the Federation's not going to try and make them respect that. Again, I quite like it. This sort of sense that there's different spheres within the Federation, and if you're living on Earth, and which is arguably a proper paradise, it's pretty close to being a utopia, then whatever. What does money mean? But as soon as you get out there and you deal with other worlds and other peoples and other stuff, then it's like, well, yeah, it kind of turns out that we do need currency and we do need a real economy. So, well, here it is. We've got money, we've got stuff, it's fine, it's all good. No one is trying to ban foreign currency, as often happens in terrestrial socialist governments. So you can participate in business, in commerce, in capitalism of all sorts, and the Federation just doesn't care. And in fact, the Federation's pretty into local autonomy on all levels, which is a wise move, because a galaxy is a huge place, and it's really hard to run stuff centrally anyway, and since they don't have an overwhelming economic model, there's very few decisions that would need to be made in Federation Parliament to affect a world many light years away. What's the point? They have these founding documents, and they do have interstate commerce regulation role, but in effect, a lot of the laws are left up to the member states as long as they comply with the overall Federation law. Again, happy with that. This is all good stuff, and I think that yes, the model for the UFP is the US, but in a way it's an updated model of the US, because the US grew out of sort of necessity and principle, but reality, because they wanted to actually be a nation, whereas the UFP is like an entirely artificial construct. So they just went with, I think that this is probably the best way to run it, and that gives the most amount of local autonomy that it can. It has a federal government that is reasonably legitimate. Jobs are good, and we're all happy with that. Another sort of streak of politics that runs through the Federation is the fact that even though, at least for members and full citizens, there is theoretically no need to work, but there is a huge degree of social pressure to work. It is assumed that everyone is going to get a job. And you don't necessarily have to be making money doing it, but you better be doing something. And it doesn't really matter what, as long as you're being good at it. And that's kind of interesting in its own way, because although the Federation's not quite beyond scarcity across the whole Federation, lots of parts of it are. There's no possibility that you're going to starve if you live on Earth. And yet, people go to school and they learn normal lessons, and there's a sense that, well, you're going to go get a job. And I think that this is kind of connected to the heroic narrative of the Federation, if you can call it that. It's not heroic in a military sense, although some of the heroes are military, they're Starfleet folks. But the Federation has kind of made science and progress in a technical, scientific way integral to its heroic sense of self. The Federation loves a scientist. Your Reg Barclays of the Star Trek world are, if not rock stars, but they're well-respected people in society. And that drive towards you're going to go and make the world a better place, which sounds very fluffy, but within the context of the Federation, it is pushed on people to some degree, that you're going to study a thing, you're going to discover new things, and if you're not, what the hell use are you? And again, I think that that's quite a right-wing message. There is never the overwhelming sense that the Federation state or even the planetary state will support people who don't want to work. They'll support people who can't work for whatever reason. But even if you have a very severe disability, the Federation will put you back together and find something that you can do. Not like in Starship Troopers, but they will adapt you or adapt an environment to you so that you can be a contributing member of society. And while that is a choice, it's not really presented as a choice. I think that's kind of an interesting thing. We don't see a lot of early schooling in Star Trek, but I think it's pretty clear that there is a message there that all of you kids are gonna do something. And maybe it is easier to be a trumpeter or a saxophonist or whatever you fancy in the Federation. Go be a playwright. And there's less economic pressure to be successful doing that. But at the same time, there's a feeling that these kind of jobs aren't as well respected. It's the people that are pushing the boundaries of knowledge who are really the ones that are appreciated by society. And it's cool, if you want to be a musician, a writer, or whatever, but they sort of live, I won't say at the bottom of society, but they kind of occupy the same place that they do in ours as people who are, if not useless, but they are not the people that you aspire to unless you're aspiring to the very, very top of them. You aspire to be a scientist, an officer, an explorer, or even just a capitalist. You aspire to make money doing something somewhere. And so there's still a good deal of the Federation which does have that motive to it. But even where there is no direct profit motive, you got to go get a job, kid. And we see that in quite a few places, but I think the best example is that in the Federation, even on Earth, restaurants still have waiters and they still have sous chefs. Young people at the start of their careers who are doing terrible jobs for not a lot of money or no money at all. These are people who are not there to better the whole of human society, are they? They're doing the same as young people do in our world. They're just working because that's what you do. And even if there's no money involved, well, you get things like replicator rations, you get things like the use of transporters, the use of interstellar communications. There's things to be earned there. And I think that notion of earning is quite central to the Federation's overall goal. You earn your membership, you earn your place amongst the other nations, you earn the right to not need to work, I guess. But in doing so, you also kind of discover that maybe you do need to be earning things. And, you take all of these factors together and you can see that while the on-paper values of the Federation, the things of the peaceful cooperation and rule of law, etc., these sound very fluffy, but the Federation kind of puts them together in a way that's more robust. It puts them together in a way that says, you need to do these, you need to believe these, you need to live these principles we're not going to help you, but we are going to hold you to those principles. And I like that. I like that these are not things that the Federation will construct for you, that they make you construct yourself and to find your own sense of meaning, both as a society, as a whole planet, but also as an individual. You get nothing for free in the Federation, even though the Federation could give you a great deal for free. Whatever you get, you earn. So the Federation is living its principles for the most part, and particularly that kind of non-interference, not uplifting aspect of its principles. And you sort of look at it from the outside and you think that maybe the Federation are useful idiots. They're very smiley and happy and they love to negotiate with anything. If the Xenomorphs from Aliens were in this universe, the Federation would be trying to find a way to admit them to the Federation. And presumably the Klingons would be hunting them for sport, like the absolute chads they obviously are. That's another topic. But the thing is that while those kind of principles, they set the Federation up for a classic paradox of tolerance, the peaceful coexistence approach, it does strive to respect the beliefs of everyone, even people with really terrible beliefs. And on the inside and the outside and everywhere in between, there's a lot of really terrible beliefs going on. And you have to respect that they still stay committed to those principles, to say, well, I will defend your right to say it. And it does have a lot of bad side effects, whether there's groups like, I think they're the new essentialists that we see in DS9, and there's kind of separatist groups like the Maquis, and there's external threats like the Klingons and Cardassians and everyone. There's all of these opposing philosophies and beliefs out there, and the Federation, for the most part, does just try and tolerate it, to the point where they make their own problem with the Cardassians and the Maquis. They're sort of, we're going to try and do a peaceful land swap. I was like, well, that's not going to work because the Cardassians are really dreadful. And yet they do it anyway. They give it a go. They try to. And that's kind of where they get this image of being like lawful idiots, that they just kind of stick to this principle. It reminds me of seeing William Riker get cloned by a transporter, and Starfleet says, yeah, it's fine, we'll just let the clone stay in Starfleet, that's no big deal. It's like, that's not a good idea. And not just because it worked out badly, but just because this is a weird thing. Do not let weird things into your military. Anyway, so the Federation is tolerant almost to a fault. We see them agreeing to things that they really shouldn't do, simply to try and be peaceful and coexistence. And for all of this stuff, the illusion that we're making is that the UFP is the dream of what America could be if America didn't do dreadful things all the time. But the thing is that the UFP kind of does dreadful things all the time, and that's how they solve this kind of this ongoing paradox of tolerance, of tolerating terrible enemies to exist when they really shouldn't. So yes, they are tolerant, obviously, socially and societally and whatever, and even in ways that seem foolhardy, but much like the US, which on contact with reality had to become a little bit more terrible than its founding fathers hoped, the UFP found the same exact thing, that there were really implacable foes out there. And yes, you could fight them, but you don't want to fight them to the death all the time. And so you start creating, these secret organizations, these secret aspects of the Federation that are there just simply because you can't afford not to have them. You have your space CIA, you have a really powerful military apparatus. They say they're scientists, they do say that. And there's a bunch of people who run those organizations who are, well, they are determined to see the Federation continue onwards. Their vision of the Federation is to keep it alive and to keep the people living in it, who are mostly living in comfortable and never having to know the burdens of what it takes to keep them there. Section 31 are the absolute pinnacle of this. It's not even clear if anyone knows if they're actually a part of the Federation, but someone's certainly funding them, and bits of the Federation, or at least of Starfleet, seem to be okay with them existing. But, they could be the space Illuminati, or they could be run by aliens. Absolutely no one knows. I mean, it's more likely that they're just a sort of an off-the-books project of Starfleet intelligence, but they kind of are the sharp end of the spear that's standing for what the Federation hopes to be. And it's hypocritical and distasteful that they have to go to very dark and shadowy methods of doing it, but there is very little alternative. And if the choice is the Federation survives or the Federation dies, well, yeah, you're going to have your Black Ops teams out there somewhere who are going to very, very quietly do things to further your interests. I think that what's interesting about it, though, is that these bodies are a shock to individual citizens of the Federation. I think that that's kind of interesting because the people, the lay citizenry of the Federation have kind of bought into the belief that, oh, we are a peaceful, tolerant society, so why would we need these things? It shouldn't come as a surprise. The Federation's fought lots of wars. It knows that other civilizations have got their own, their own spies and intelligence apparatus, and so obviously the Federation's going to have it. The people either have not thought about it, which I think is most likely, or reject the notion that they would do that, and that's what's weird to me. I don't know if it's just because the intelligence organs are so well hidden, but there's a distinct lack of cynicism within the Federation about their own government. Hopefully the children are not being told, oh, we would never do that. Hopefully they've just not stopped to think about it because they live a million miles away from the edges. But of course it's the rough edges and how they conflict with the Federation's core values that makes them a compelling player in a space opera, right? It makes something that you want to write works within, that you want to have stories with. Because we're always seeing the principles coming up against the realities of what you have to actually do, not just to survive, but to get the job done generally. The Federation has a very strong superego, this very strong drive to make things better, and they keep falling short of it, but they are earnestly trying, and that includes feeling ashamed of the fact that they have their own Black Ops team to murder Romulan senators. And because there's an earnest desire to be better and to, if not be perfect, but be better, because there is that earnest desire in there, it almost makes this stuff excusable. While no one really likes that these exist, even when we see people find out about them, and they are shocked to begin with, but they eventually decide, well, actually, I mean, maybe we do need this. And they do come around to it, and they do see that, wherever there is difficult things happening, that the Federation needs to make difficult decisions. And perhaps there's even a value in not telling the population the full goings on. Keeping things not just secret, but beyond secret, things that no one will ever know. The fact that the Federation could be a paradise, it's not, but it could be. And the fact that it's trying to be, and that this isn't just a facade, means that we kind of root for it, and we say that yes, some amount of plotted political murder is absolutely fine. And that dualism obviously makes them interesting, and it makes them a liberal society as best as we can see it from the modern era. When we think backwards, forwards, whichever way, and we think about a state and we think about what it is and what it does and how it protects and defends its people and its values, we always see this exact same thing happening. That, well, we need sometimes to break our own rules, and we're not so hidebound by them, by these principles, that we won't do it even when it's in our own interest. And, it's very useful to separate that function out into a completely deniable branch of the military somewhere. But all of this stuff is completely recognizable and completely relatable. It means that, the Federation is just as flawed and hypocritical as we are in the modern era. And that's kind of what you get when you set up a real government, is that it always has problems. It always has real key issues. It never manages to live up to its principles. And the thing that the Federation gets right is kind of not even trying to. It does its best, and it's always trying to do better, but it's not afraid of saying, well, we need to do distasteful things for a good cause, because some things are that dreadful. And that kind of takes us back to all of the things that the Federation does tolerate. It's distressing to see that the Federation will allow the enslavement of Bajor to continue, and for the Marquis to be seen as terrorists and seeing them being executed and whatnot, and that they won't get involved. But part of this but it comes back to a sort of a greater understanding of what the Federation is supposed to be, because while it is powerful and it does get its hands dirty, it's also against the idea of intervention in any of these things, and it takes quite a lot of moral courage to say, sorry, we can't. And it's like, well, yeah, you could, but the only way to do that is to effectively topple the Cardassian government. You can't just liberate Bajor and walk away. You would have to completely undermine the whole Cardassian empire. That's not a great idea. That's a huge undertaking, and it sucks. And I think, again, the Federation feels ashamed that it's not able to do that. But what the Federation does do is that when it sees its opportunities to make a difference, it does take them. It's imperfect in that regard. We would love to see the Federation just run to the rescue, but equally, this is not their war to fight. And they're very clear that this is not their war to fight. This is your war to fight. And if you want the Federation's help, well, we'll help in whatever way we can. Well, we're not going to spend our blood and treasure in a futile war that will result in many, many more deaths than would have happened if we had just ignored the thing in the process. And in fact, this is an inversion of how we see the US operating throughout the 20th century. So many bad ideas, these regime change wars, these interventions in whatever country, where the intervention just causes chaos. Because you can never truly conquer these huge spaces, and nothing is huger than space, than planets. The Federation is not going to come and occupy every single planet. If they can't quietly leave them to their own devices once the war's over, there's no point in fighting them, because they're not conquerors, and even if they wanted to be, they simply don't have the resources to do that. They're powerful and they have a great deal of resources, but not enough to monitor every living Cardassian. So it does take a lot of moral courage to say no, and to be coldly realpolitik, and to coldly say, I'm sorry, we have the Prime Directive, or we have this, or we have that, all of these prohibitions. And yes, they don't apply always, but that's part of running a real government, is sometimes you say, well, I'm okay with being hypocritical about this. And there's a fine line to walk. You can't be bellicose, you can't be the British Empire, at least not if you have the principles of the Federation. You can't be doing this stuff where you just go and start wars just for the sake of it. And you can't be going and starting wars just because it gives your military something to do. You got to be starting wars for a good reason, and then following through and finishing them, and actually making things better afterwards. You can't just invade and then say, actually, never mind, you lot can figure it out. That's a terrible idea, and that's how you end up with space ISIS. And no one wants space ISIS. That's a terrible, terrible thing for the whole galaxy. I would still like to see the Federation be a bit more robust in how it uses its might, but I also like the fact that its wrestling with decisions mirrors the way that real decisions get made, because sometimes you do just have to say no, and that's just a reality of government which overrides any principles. And that's why no matter what you think of the Federation as a unit, as a polity, it is always a realist before it is an idealist. And that makes it something that we can learn quite a lot from, because we should all be following what the Federation does, right? We should be trying to follow an ideal, but without being idealists and without being legalists for that ideal. We should be finding the golden mean of when to act and when not to, and when things are good and when we would just make them worse. That's something that makes the Federation feel really aspirational at all times, and I love it. I think that's what makes it a really compelling place to set stories in, because there's this constant battle between the ideal and the reality and everything else that's around it. All of these really dangerous and implacable things that just kind of come from nowhere and say, again, will you keep to your ideals if it means that you don't get conquered by the Borg? And in fact, on that point, I love the fact that the Federation always says, yep, we will happily survive. We will do all of the bad things if it means that we'll survive. Because that's what states do. And no matter what philosophy they were following, you'd always expect them to make that. And we shouldn't even be surprised that that's the case. So it's an interesting idea for future governance, and it's kind of federalism done right in lots of ways, even down to the the occasional mass murder and whatever, because these things are just a reality of being a state in a world of other states. It's still great and compelling and interesting. It's a great place to tell stories, and it's an interesting thought experiment about how you could run a galactic empire along a liberal mold. I know lots of people don't believe that it is. There's this sense that it must be horribly commie, but I really don't believe it at all, honestly. I think that the Federation is what you get if you, at some point in your history, are thinking, well, maybe we are post-scarcity and maybe we can be communists. And then you say, no. We want to still be self-actualized individuals who have roles and purpose and that do things in our society. And it's also a government that's made a conscious decision that they're not going to be wimps, that they are going to get their hands dirty. So the Federation's not a utopia, and it's not even close to one. But what it is a liberal framework to work towards a utopia. It's kind of set the boundaries of what a utopia could be, in that you would have to define the utopia for yourself. And I think that that's kind of the best message that comes out of the Federation as a setting, is that no one's going to tell you what you should be doing. Everything is up to yourself to do it. You build it, you earn it, you go and do it yourself. There's a huge amount of support there if you want to go find it, if you want to learn things. It's all there to be had, but in the end, you still have to do it yourself. I think that that's something that speaks to a lot of people, and for a lot of reasons as well, because it's quite empowering to think of yourself living in a world where it's meritocratic almost entirely, living in a world where the creations of humanity, but aliens as well, but these things like replicators, warp drives, interstellar communications, these are achievements of a society, and it kind of goes to show what societies that work together and that prize achievement can achieve. It just leaves you with the ongoing sense of yeah, this is a place that I would want to live in, even knowing the bad stuff about it. Alright, so that's my thoughts about the Federation. I'm going to continue doing this run of kind of fictional sci-fi governments and just kind of see where it leads to. I think it's interesting to kind of contrast what's there between the Federation and the Imperium and various interstellar governments and see how they hold up and what makes them tick. So I'm just going to keep running with that, and we'll do the Imperium next, because they're kind of mirror images of each other in lots of ways. Alright, so by all means go and watch earlier things that I've done, even though there's not a huge amount of them just yet. And go check them out, they're still interesting. I'm kind of still working on what the format is and how tightly I want to script things and how to edit them, all kinds of crap. So this is a work in progress, but maybe go and see where all this started off and see if I've improved even just in a couple of weeks.